Florida is trying to reclaim a Republican edge in the nationwide redistricting fight. Governor Ron DeSantis has introduced a congressional map that could flip 4 House seats. Florida lawmakers will debate these new voting lines in a special session beginning today. Now, it comes as the Virginia Supreme Court heard arguments in a challenge to the constitutional amendment approved by voters last week that would allow redrawn maps favoring Democrats in that state. In the case of Florida, if the Florida map passes, it could essentially wipe out the wins by Virginia Democrats last week. So I want to bring in CBS News' election law expert and contributor David Becker to talk more about this. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of this, David, I want people to understand the differences that some states are, the procedures that some states are using to change these districts, vis-a-vis the way that Virginia and California did it and the way that, for example, Texas and now Florida is proposing to do it. We mentioned in the introduction that in the case of Virginia, it was the will of the voters that allowed those changes to go into effect. Explain how Florida is attempting to do it and how, for example, Texas did it as well.
Yeah, what we've seen over the past couple of decades is that several states, more likely Democratic states, have moved towards nonpartisan redistricting and put that into their constitutions or passed laws that required commissions or others to draw lines that were that eliminated to some degree partisan gerrymandering. California did that and Virginia did that. And so when they wanted to move away from that in response to, we should remember this all started with President Trump calling Texas, pressuring them to draw new districts, then they had to put this to the voters. Texas and Florida don't have those provisions, although Florida does have a law that says partisan gerrymandering is illegal. It's not clear whether their Supreme Court is going to, how it's going to interpret that law. But both are doing this solely with the legislatures, not through going to the voters first, as California and Virginia did. And we should also note that this is incredibly unusual. In the previous 50 plus years before 2025, there were 3 times when a state, any state, had chosen voluntarily to redistrict mid-decade. Florida will make the 8th in the last year. And this means tens of millions of voters are going to find themselves in entirely new districts with new representatives, unfamiliar with what the lines of those districts look like. And election officials are going to have to do a ton of work to make sure they're all getting the right ballot when they vote this year.
So then why is this a priority for Republicans, given that Florida already leans Republican?
Yeah, I mean, I can't really speak to the politics. I don't know why the Republicans and Democrats are doing this. And when they draw these lines, they're basing these lines on past voting behavior. And what we know is that in the first election after a new president takes office, as we're going to see in 2026 and as we saw in 1994, in 2010 and 2018, it's very likely there are going to be, to some degree, wave elections against the party in power. And that could change the electoral dynamics. So what we also know is that these are states, although they're red and blue states, they're not entirely red and blue states. 40% of California voted for President Trump. 43% of Texas voted for Vice President Harris, same as in Florida, 43% voted for Vice President Harris. And if these maps hold to predictions, which I don't think is likely, but they'll likely hold somewhat to predictions, those ratios are going to be all out of whack with regard to what those states actually look like.
Yeah, ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes down to turnout, and that is always a big question, especially now with these redistricting efforts. David Becker, always good to have you, my friend. Thank you.
Thanks, Vlad.